Chapter 1. Silver Creek's Beloved Schoolteacher. The warm morning sun streamed through the narrow windows of the one-room schoolhouse, spilling golden light across the rows of wooden desks. The scent of freshly sharpened pencils and chalk filled the air as Annabelle Whitlock stood at the front, her blue dress swaying slightly as she wrote an arithmetic problem on the chalkboard. "Now, class," she said with a smile that could melt the hardest of hearts, "if you're helping your brother with 5 apples and he eats 3, how many apples do you have left?" She paused and shot a teasing look at one of her younger students, Billy, who was squirming in his seat. "And no, Billy, you cannot eat the apples yourself." The room erupted into giggles, and Annabelle's heart swelled with the simple joy of her work. The children's laughter was the soundtrack of her life, a reminder that even in a small, dusty town like Silver Creek, she could make a difference. Her students were more than just pupils. They were her little family, each one holding a piece of her heart. Billy raised his hand, his eyes wide with excitement. Two apples," he called out proudly. "That's right, Billy," Annabelle replied, her eyes softening as she gave him an approving nod. "Now, who can tell me the answer to this one?" She turned to the next problem, but her voice softened just for a moment as she glanced toward the window. Something about the day felt different. The air outside was still, too still, like the town itself was holding its breath. But before she could dwell on it, the heavy thud of boots on the schoolhouse steps broke through her thoughts. She turned as the door swung open, and Sheriff Harold Tate stepped inside, his face tight with concern. He removed his hat, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on Annabelle. "Ma'am," he greeted her, his deep voice filled with a rare urgency that immediately caught her attention. "I hate to trouble you, but we've had some strange animal sightings near the outskirts of town. Folks are getting nervous." Annabelle's brow furrowed and she gave a small shake of her head. "Sheriff, you know I'm more concerned with making sure these kids learn their numbers than with some rumors about wild animals." She forced a smile, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up her spine. "It's probably just coyotes." The sheriff hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Maybe so, ma'am, but folks are saying they've seen something much larger. Something that doesn't quite add up." His voice lowered, his eyes flicking to the children, who were now whispering among themselves. "Be careful, Miss Whitlock." Annabelle straightened, brushing a lock of chestnut hair behind her ear. "I'll be fine, Sheriff," she replied with more confidence than she felt. She knew the sheriff meant well, but she didn't have time for baseless fears. "I've got to finish up with these students before I head over to little Timmy's house to deliver his homework." Sheriff Tate gave a brief nod, but his worry didn't seem to fade. "If you say so," he said reluctantly, tipping his hat as he turned to leave. "Just keep your eyes open." The door closed behind him and Annabelle found herself standing at the front of the classroom, the laughter of the children now replaced by an eerie silence. Her heart was still racing slightly, but she forced herself to focus, walking back to the chalkboard as she turned her attention back to her students. "All right, class," she said with a little more determination in her voice. "Let's get back to our math, shall we?" She gave a playful wink to the group, hoping to lift the mood. Later that afternoon, after the children had left for their homes, Annabelle packed up her things and slipped into her warm leather boots. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over Silver Creek. The town was peaceful, too peaceful. As she walked toward the outskirts of town, the hair on the back of her neck prickled, and she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was watching her. She paused for a moment, glancing over her shoulder, but the street was empty. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. She shook her head. It was probably nothing. Sheriff Tate had made her nervous for no reason. But as she continued on, she heard a distant sound that made her pause again. An animal's growl, deep and guttural. Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively quickened her pace, telling herself it was just a stray dog. But the growl came again, closer this time. Annabelle's pulse raced as she reached Timmy's house, her hands trembling slightly as she knocked on the door. Timmy's mother, Mrs. Benson, opened the door with a warm smile. "Miss Whitlock, how kind of you to bring Timmy's homework. Please come in." Annabelle smiled, but her thoughts were still far away, lingering on the strange noises from the woods. As she handed over the homework, she made a mental note to stay close to the heart of town from now on. As the evening settled in, Annabelle finally returned to her modest cottage, locking the door behind her. She sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the fading sunlight. For a moment, everything was calm again, the strange sensation of being watched slowly fading as she focused on the sound of her own breath. But even as she settled into the warmth of her home, a thought tugged at the back of her mind, the unsettling sensation lingering, and she couldn't help but wonder what was really out there in the woods. Annabelle's boots clicked steadily against the dirt road as she made her way home from Timmy's house, the weight of the day lifting with each step. The evening air had a cool bite to it, the kind of chill that hinted at the changing seasons. Silver Creek, normally quiet and peaceful, felt unusually still. It wasn't just the absence of the usual bustle of town. It was a deeper quiet, as though the very earth itself had held its breath. The wind, usually a familiar companion, had stilled. The trees that lined the road stood motionless, their branches twisted and silent like skeletal fingers reaching toward the heavens. Annabelle couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up her spine. She paused for a moment, glancing over her shoulder. Her breath hitched when she noticed something in the shadows. Just beyond the edge of the road, where the trees thickened and swallowed the last vestiges of sunlight, a pair of glowing eyes watched her intently. Her heart rate quickened, her instincts urging her to move faster. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered wild animals in these parts, but this felt different. There was something watching her, waiting. The glow from the eyes didn't blink, didn't falter. They were fixed on her, too aware, too deliberate to be those of a mere animal. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she quickened her pace, her footsteps loud in the sudden silence. As she walked, her thoughts raced. Perhaps it was just a wild animal, maybe a bear or a large cat. But deep down, a part of her recognized the instinctive fear. She had been raised around these forests her whole life, and yet something about this was wrong. It wasn't just the eyes. It was the way they made her feel, like she was the prey. Her breath hitched again when the eyes remained, never wavering, never blinking. She forced herself to look ahead, willing the feeling of being watched to fade, but it only grew stronger. The forest silence became deafening as she continued along the road, her pulse drumming in her ears. Every rustle of the wind seemed too loud. The leaves, the branches, even the earth beneath her feet. All of it seemed to hum with tension. Her senses felt heightened, as if she could hear every small movement in the woods, the faintest shift in the shadows. And then it happened. A massive shadow moved at the edge of her vision, darting between the trees with terrifying speed. Annabelle's heart lurched in her chest as the figure stepped into the path ahead, its form materializing from the darkness like a nightmare given flesh. A wolf. No, not just any wolf. It was enormous, its coat a sleek midnight black that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its eyes, glowing with an unnatural amber hue, locked onto her with a predatory focus that made her blood run cold. The sheer size of it, the power in its movement, it wasn't a creature of the wild, not in the way she had ever known them. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't even have time to react, to scream or flee. The wolf moved like a blur, a flash of terrifying speed. Before she could even comprehend what was happening, it was upon her, its jaws snapping out of the shadows. The impact hit her chest like a battering ram, and she was thrown to the ground, the air knocked from her lungs. Her arm was caught in the wolf's mouth, its teeth sinking into her flesh with a force that sent a scream of pain and terror through her body. She could feel the weight of the beast pressing down on her, its hot breath searing her skin. She gasped, her world spinning, the darkness creeping in from the edges of her vision. The sharp pain in her arm was nothing compared to the shock of what was happening. She tried to scream, tried to push the wolf away, but it was far too strong. Her thoughts blurred. The world shifted and twisted around her as she struggled to stay conscious, her fingers trembling as they scraped against the earth. The wolf's grip tightened, pulling her arm as though to drag her into the shadows, and then everything went black. The last thing Annabelle felt was the wolf's grip tightening around her arm as the world spun into darkness. The first thing Annabelle felt when she woke was the heat. Her arm burned like fire, the searing pain forcing a groan from her throat as she struggled to open her eyes. It took a few moments before her surroundings came into focus, and when they did, they only deepened her confusion. The room around her was dim, the only light coming from a flickering lantern on a wooden table by the window. The air smelled of pine, the kind of earthy scent that made her think of deep forests and forgotten places. She was lying on a straw mattress, its rough texture pressing against her skin. The familiar sounds of Silver Creek were absent, replaced by the quiet hum of nature, an unfamiliar stillness that sent an unease skittering through her. Annabelle shifted, trying to sit up, but the movement sent a spike of pain through her arm. She gasped, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Her fingers grazed the tender skin of her arm, and it felt hot, as if it were burning from the inside out. A voice interrupted her panic, calm but firm. "You need to rest." Annabelle's head snapped toward the sound, her heart racing as her gaze landed on the man who had been tending to her. He stood by the small table, his back to her, his broad shoulders filling out the rough spun shirt he wore. His hair was dark, tousled, and just long enough to be unruly, but it was his eyes, piercing green, sharp and intense, that held her attention. They were focused on her, watching her every move as if she were something fragile, something important. "Where am I?" Annabelle's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper as she struggled to sit up further. The heat in her arm made it impossible to ignore the intensity of the pain, but she had to know what had happened. The man, Cole, she realized, finally turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, his jaw set with a quiet resolve that only made her feel more uneasy. His presence was commanding, even in the silence between them. His eyes flicked to her injured arm, then back to her face. "You're safe," he said, his voice low and soothing, but there was a hardness there, a guardedness that made her pulse race with more than just fear. Annabelle's breath caught. "What happened to me?" Her throat ached with the effort of speaking, but she couldn't stop herself. The questions tumbled out in a rush, desperate for answers. "How did I get here? Why does my arm hurt like this?" Carl stepped closer, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something soft, almost tender, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same implacable calm. "You were attacked," he explained. "A wolf. It bit you." Annabelle recoiled at the memory, her heart hammering against her ribs. A wolf? She could still hear its growl in her mind, feel its teeth sinking into her arm. Her hand instinctively went to the wound, but she winced at the pain, biting her lip to keep from crying out. "Why am I here?" she demanded again, the words more insistent this time, though her voice shook, her head swam with confusion. "I don't remember." Cole's gaze softened ever so slightly, though the distance between them remained. He didn't seem to be in a hurry to provide more answers. Instead, he reached down to gently press his hand against her shoulder, urging her to lie back down. "You need to rest," he repeated, his voice steady but unyielding. "You've lost a lot of blood. You're not in any condition to be asking questions." The command in his tone made her bristle, but there was a strange warmth in the way his hand lingered on her, a grounding presence that she couldn't deny. Her pulse quickened, but not from fear. It was something else, something she couldn't put her finger on. Annabelle swallowed, biting back the frustration that clawed at her. She knew she had to trust him, at least for now. The pain in her arm was too much to ignore, and the exhaustion from everything, being attacked, being here, surrounded by this stranger, was wearing on her. "I need to understand," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Please." Cole didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on her for a moment longer, as though considering something he wasn't sure he should say. Finally, he sighed, a deep, reluctant sound. "You're not like other people," he said, his tone so quiet that she almost didn't catch it. "You've been marked." Annabelle frowned, her confusion growing. "Marked?" She repeated the word slowly, trying to make sense of it, but the more she thought about it, the more the words made her feel uneasy, like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Marked by what? The shift in the atmosphere was subtle, but it was there, a tension that hadn't been there before, one that crackled in the air between them. She could feel it deep in her chest. Something had changed. Something had shifted. Without warning, a distant howl broke the silence. Annabelle froze. The sound echoed through the cabin, low and mournful. Then another joined it, a chorus of wolves calling to each other in the night. It was far off but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, her senses sharpening in a way that startled her. She gasped, her hand trembling as she reached for the edge of the mattress. What is that?" Cole's gaze flicked to the window, then back to her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something guarded. "Wolves," he said, his voice lower now, as though he were speaking a truth he didn't want her to hear. The howls grew louder, more urgent, as if the pack were drawing closer. Annabelle's breath caught in her throat, her body tensing. She could feel every shift in the air, the sound of the wolves' voices cutting through the silence like a sharpened blade. She could smell the pine sap more vividly now, could taste the sharp bite of the night air in her lungs. Everything about her seemed to heighten, her senses, her instincts. Everything that made her human was suddenly so much sharper. "Relax." Cole's voice was soft, but it was edged with something darker, something dangerous. He stepped closer, his presence enveloping her. "They won't come for you." But Annabelle wasn't so sure. The pull of the howls resonated deep within her chest, and though her mind told her to be wary, her body felt the call in a way she couldn't deny. The door to the cabin creaked. Annabelle's pulse leapt in her throat as she turned toward the sound, her heart racing. She could hear the shifting of movement outside, the snapping of branches as something approached. Cole stepped in front of her, his broad frame blocking her view of the door. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. The tension in the room was palpable. Then, as if on cue, the howls stopped. Silence fell. But it wasn't comforting. It was the calm before the storm. Chapter 2. The Blood-Red Moon. Annabelle's sleep was restless, plagued by vivid dreams that made no sense, yet felt so real. She tossed and turned in the straw mattress, her skin slick with sweat, her breath shallow as she drifted in and out of unconsciousness. In the midst of her dreams, she ran, her legs moving with unnatural speed, the world blurring around her. She could hear the thunderous beat of her heart, but it wasn't just hers. Other hearts thudded in unison. The scent of pine and damp earth was overwhelming, mixed with something else, something wild, something she couldn't name. Ahead of her, a massive pack of wolves ran together under a blood-red moon, their bodies sleek and powerful, their fur glistening in the eerie light. She felt their presence, felt the pull of something deep within her, a bond that tethered her to them. The wolves' howls filled the air, a beautiful, haunting chorus. Annabelle wanted to run with them, to join the pack, but as she tried, her body betrayed her. She stumbled, unable to keep up. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached for them, but the moon above began to bleed, the red light consuming the wolves, the forest, and her entire world. With a strangled cry, she fell to her knees, unable to break free from the weight of the moon's pull, the wolves' distant howls fading into nothingness. The sound of rustling nearby pulled Annabelle from the nightmare, her eyes snapping open to the dimly lit cabin. Her body was drenched in sweat, her heart racing as the remnants of the dream clung to her, the feeling of the wolves' presence lingering in her chest. She gasped for air, pushing herself up from the mattress. Her arm burned, the wound throbbing painfully, but it was nothing compared to the way her heart felt. Wild, disoriented, like it had been torn between two worlds. A figure stood over her. Her pulse quickened at the sight of Cole, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He was sitting on the edge of her bed, watching her with a quiet intensity that sent a wave of heat rushing to her cheeks. He'd been there all along. She hadn't noticed him, hadn't realized how much time had passed since she'd fallen asleep. His presence was so constant, so steady, that she felt like she couldn't breathe without him in the room. "Are you okay?" His voice was low, almost a growl, as he leaned closer, his gaze fixed on her. The warmth from his body seemed to radiate toward her, a magnetic pull that made it hard for her to think straight. Annabelle swallowed, trying to gather her thoughts. Her pulse was still hammering, and her senses felt heightened, too sharp, like the world had suddenly grown too vivid, too real. The moonlight streaming through the window seemed brighter than it should be, the smell of the pine trees outside stronger, more intoxicating. She couldn't focus. Her mind was still reeling from the dream, the wolves, the pull of something inside her that she couldn't explain. "What's happening to me?" Her voice was shaky, desperate for answers she wasn't sure she wanted. The dream was still fresh in her mind, the wolves running beneath that blood-red moon, and the bond she felt with them. With him, she could still feel the echoes of that pull deep in her chest. Cole's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. For a moment he was silent, as though weighing his words. She could see the hesitation in his gaze, the reluctance to speak, but he didn't look away. His gaze was unwavering, as if he were trying to read her soul. "You're changing," he said finally, his voice low, grim. Annabelle's heart skipped a beat at the words. Changing? What did that mean? Was it the wound? Was it something worse? The fear that had been gnawing at her insides began to grow, spreading through her like wildfire. She reached for her arm, where the pain still lingered, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing sensation in her chest. The world around her felt too big, too overwhelming, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold herself together. "Changing into what?" Her voice cracked as she pressed for more, her words desperate. "What do you mean?" Cole's gaze softened, but only for a fraction of a second. "I can't explain it all right now," he said, his voice rough with something she couldn't quite place. He stood abruptly, his tall form looming over her. "You're not ready to understand. You need to rest, and you need to accept what's happening." Annabelle stared at him, her pulse racing, but she didn't argue. He was right about one thing. Her mind was too scattered, too confused to make sense of any of it. All she could do was sit there, still trembling from the remnants of the dream, the feeling of the wolves' eyes on her still haunting her. Cole moved away, his steps heavy, like he carried the weight of something that she couldn't yet grasp. It took hours before Annabelle could calm the storm inside her, before her senses dulled enough for her to fall into an uneasy sleep once more. But when she woke again, the feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. The moonlight slanted through the window in pale streaks, casting a glow on the room that felt almost unnatural. Her heart raced again, the same unease creeping up her spine. She wasn't sure what had possessed her, but before she could stop herself, she slipped out of the bed. The room was still quiet, and Cole was nowhere to be found. Her heightened senses told her he wasn't far. She could smell the earthy scent of pine from the trees outside and the faint hint of his cologne mixed with something else, something wild. Annabelle moved toward the door, her heart thudding as she stepped out into the cold night air. She needed to understand, to see with her own eyes what was happening to her. The world around her felt sharper, more vivid, every rustle in the trees, every scent, every sound echoing in her mind. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked deeper into the woods, the pull of something far greater than her own fears guiding her forward. Then she saw them. A pack of wolves stood in the clearing ahead. They were huge, larger than any wolves she had ever seen, their eyes glowing with that same amber light that had haunted her dreams. Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse thundering in her ears as they slowly turned toward her. And then one stepped forward, his eyes fixed on her with a knowing intensity. The figure shifted and she froze in shock, her heart hammering. A man stood where the wolf had been, his body tall and powerful, his eyes the same amber glow that now burned into her soul. He was the same Cole. Her breath hitched as panic gripped her chest. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her senses, too sharp now, flooded her with too much, and she collapsed, her body succumbing to the weight of everything. And then everything went dark. Annabelle's world was a swirl of confusion and panic as she woke, the dark haze of unconsciousness lifting slowly. The chill of the night air kissed her skin, and the first thing she felt was Cole's strong arms wrapped around her, holding her steady. Her body was cradled against his chest, the steady beat of his heart reverberating in her ears, a stark contrast to the panic that surged through her own. Her breath caught in her throat. What happened? Everything felt disjointed, like a dream slipping through her fingers. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the woods, but she was far from the clearing where she had collapsed. Cole's grip tightened around her as he gently lowered her to the ground, his face unreadable as he set her back on her feet. Annabelle's pulse raced, her head spinning as she tried to make sense of the situation. The woods, the wolves, the man who had shifted in front of her. All of it seemed too surreal, too impossible, but she couldn't ignore the deep, unsettling sense of reality that gnawed at her. The pull, the connection, the way her senses felt sharper and more alive, she couldn't deny it. Something had changed. Something inside her was different. "You're awake." Cole's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that made her freeze. Annabelle swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing as her heart slammed against her chest. "What? What happened?" Her voice shook as she took a step back from him, her legs unsteady beneath her, like they couldn't quite carry her weight. Cole's gaze softened, and for the briefest moment she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes before he masked it, his expression hardening again. "You were attacked by a werewolf," he said quietly, as though saying it aloud made it somehow more real. Annabelle's breath caught. A werewolf? The word hung between them like a heavy fog, and the world around her seemed to freeze for a moment, the edges of her vision blurring. Cole stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "Yes," he said, his tone low and firm. "By me." Annabelle recoiled instinctively, the cold truth of his words hitting her like a punch to the stomach. She staggered back, her breath shallow as she tried to process what he had just said. Her pulse thrummed in her ears and the air felt thick, too thick, like it was pressing down on her chest. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No! People don't turn into wolves." Her heart pounded violently in her chest, and she took another step back, her hands trembling at her sides. Fear gripped her, a cold, unrelenting fear that took over her body and left her struggling to breathe. Cole's face softened, his gaze shifting with something akin to sadness. "You're not just any person," he said quietly, his voice laced with a tenderness that only made the fear grow sharper in her chest. "You're mine." The words hit her like a storm, a crash of emotions too overwhelming for her to process in that moment. Her hands balled into fists, her heart pounding in her ears as she tried to make sense of everything he had just said, everything that was happening to her. "No," she said again, louder this time, more forceful, as though willing herself to wake up from a nightmare. This can't be real. You're a werewolf?" Her voice wavered, but the words slipped from her mouth like a broken confession. "That's not possible." Cole's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as though holding back a flood of emotions. "It's real, Annabelle." His voice was rough now, edged with a mix of frustration and something else she couldn't place. "You've been marked, and when the full moon rises you'll feel it, you'll change." The air between them grew thick with tension, the night suddenly seeming colder, more oppressive. Annabelle's mind raced, every word Cole said reverberating in her mind, but none of it made sense. She couldn't breathe. She could hardly think straight. "Change?" Her voice cracked. "You mean I'm going to become one of them?" She motioned helplessly to the woods behind her, to the shadowy shapes of the wolves she had seen moments before. "I can't. I won't." "You don't have a choice." Cole interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "You're marked. That means you'll change. You'll become like me." The way he said it with such finality shattered whatever stability she had left. Her stomach twisted in knots, nausea rising with every word he spoke. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over, leaving her weak and trembling. She shook her head again, stepping back further, unable to contain the panic that had taken root in her chest. "I don't believe you. This isn't happening." Cole's expression softened, and his hand reached out, but Annabelle jerked away before he could touch her. The space between them seemed to stretch impossibly wide. She couldn't stand being this close to him. Not when everything felt so wrong, so foreign. Not when the reality of what he had said was sinking into her bones. "You're afraid," he said quietly, his voice filled with an understanding that only made her anger flare. "But I'm not your enemy, Annabelle. I'm not here to hurt you." "I don't know what you are," she shot back, her voice laced with fear and frustration, "but I don't trust you. I don't know who you are anymore." Cole's expression tightened, and for a split second Annabelle saw the vulnerability in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by something colder, something he was clearly trying to keep buried. "I never wanted this," he said, his words laced with pain. "I never wanted to hurt you, but you're my mate, Annabelle. I didn't ask for this either." Annabelle's heart stopped at the word mate. The world seemed to tilt, spinning out of control as everything inside her snapped. She stepped back once more, her hands shaking, her breath coming in short gasps. "No," she whispered, almost pleading. "No, I'm not your mate." Cole's gaze hardened, but his expression remained calm. "You are," he said simply, his voice unwavering, as if he were speaking a truth he had already accepted. "And whether you accept it or not, we're connected. That bond, the one that's already forming inside you, it's not something you can escape from." Annabelle wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. Her body felt frozen in place, trapped by the reality of his words, the suffocating truth that was slowly wrapping itself around her heart. She shook her head once more, her body trembling with the force of everything she was feeling. "No," she whispered again, more desperately this time. "This can't be happening." But as the full moon rose higher in the sky, her body grew cold, her heart racing in her chest, and she could feel something stirring deep inside her. The bond, the pull. She could feel it, undeniable and fierce, wrapping its tendrils around her soul. And it terrified her. Annabelle's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears as she stood in the center of the cabin, Cole's words echoing in her mind. "You're my fated mate." The air around her felt too thick, too heavy, suffocating in a way she couldn't explain. She took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps, as if she were drowning. The firelight flickered in the hearth, casting shadows that danced eerily around them, and yet she felt as though everything in the room had gone completely still. The weight of Cole's revelation pressed down on her like a physical force. Her thoughts scrambled to make sense of what he had just said, but nothing fit, nothing made sense. Fated mate. She repeated the words in her mind like a curse, a terrifying whisper of something that could change everything. "No," she breathed, shaking her head in disbelief. Her chest tightened, a coil of anger and fear winding tight. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "No," she said again, her voice louder this time. That's not possible." Cole's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her want to run. Her gaze darted to his face, to the intensity in his eyes, but she couldn't meet it for long. The bond, their bond, was pulling at her, thrumming beneath her skin, and she hated it, hated how it made her feel so exposed, so vulnerable. "I didn't ask for this," she snapped, the words harsh and defensive, spilling out before she could stop them. The anger bubbled up, hot and sharp, cutting through the confusion and fear. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be marked. I didn't ask to be pulled into your world, your wolf world." Her voice shook with the force of her emotions, but she refused to back down, refused to let him see how deeply it had rattled her. She felt everything, fear, anger, panic, and it made her feel like she was losing control of herself, of everything. Cole's jaw tightened, but there was something else in his eyes, something deeper, something softer, like a raw ache. "I didn't ask for this either," he said, his voice low, his words carrying a weight of their own. "I didn't want this bond any more than you did, but we don't get to choose who we're bound to, Annabelle. This is fate." Annabelle's chest tightened painfully. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think through the fog of her own rising panic. Her emotions churned in a storm she couldn't control, and every time she tried to push it away, it pulled her in deeper. "You can teach me to control it," Cole said, taking a step forward, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I can show you how to manage it, how to live with it, how to keep your sanity. You don't have to fight it, Annabelle." She recoiled at his words. Live with it? Her voice cracked, and she didn't care. "You want me to just accept this? You think I can just accept the fact that I'm going to turn into a wolf? That I'm going to be bound to you?" Her fists clenched at her sides, the raw energy of her fury surging through her, desperate to find a way out. "I won't do it. I won't be a part of this freak show you've got going on." The words stung even as they left her lips, and she instantly regretted them, but it was too late. The truth of what she was feeling, fear, rejection, and the overwhelming pull of the bond, was spilling out uncontrollably. Cole's eyes darkened with something that could have been hurt, but it quickly turned to resolve. He took another step toward her, his presence commanding and unwavering, but his voice softened, filled with a quiet gentleness she couldn't ignore. "You don't have to face this alone. Let me help you, Annabelle. You're my mate. That means I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Annabelle flinched, her chest tightening as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Her throat burned with the unspoken emotions that she couldn't hold back anymore. "Mate." The word echoed in her mind, and she felt as though it was slowly suffocating her, pulling her under into a sea of uncertainty and fear. She didn't want this. She didn't want him. She didn't want any of it. "Stay away from me," she snapped, her voice sharp, the command clear and firm, though it wavered with the weight of everything she couldn't say. Cole's expression hardened at the words, but his eyes never left hers. "Annabelle." "Stay away," she shouted, the anger and panic rising, drowning out every other emotion inside her. She didn't want to feel this connection to him. She didn't want the bond, didn't want to be pulled into his world, into the chaos of what it meant to be his. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She needed space. She needed to escape the pressure, the pull, the intensity of everything that was happening. Without waiting for his response, she turned, her heart pounding in her chest, and she stormed out of the cabin. The cool night air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her legs carried her through the woods, her mind a blur of confusion, anger, and overwhelming emotion. She had to get away. She couldn't be near him. She couldn't stand the weight of what he had just told her, couldn't stand the idea of being bound to him in a way she didn't understand. Every step she took, every breath she drew felt like a step further into the unknown, but just as her breath started to slow, as her thoughts began to quiet, she felt it, the pull, that invisible thread that tugged at her soul, calling her back to him, to her mate. With a strangled cry, she pushed herself harder, running through the trees, away from everything, but the bond, his bond, was already wrapping around her, pulling her closer no matter how hard she tried to resist. The classroom was suffocating. Annabelle sat at the front of the room, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as she tried to focus on the children in front of her. She could hear them, their soft whispers, their shifting in their seats, the tapping of pencils against desks. But it wasn't just that. The sounds, the scents, they were all so sharp, so alive. She could smell the faint lavender of Clara's perfume, the lingering musk of the classroom walls, the crisp paper of textbooks. Every detail felt amplified to the point of suffocation. Annabelle's breath hitched as she tried to steady herself, but it wasn't working. The room spun around her, the sounds becoming a chaotic symphony of noise that she couldn't escape. Her skin tingled, her senses alive in a way that was both overwhelming and terrifying. Her chest tightened with panic. "What is happening to me?" She reached for the chalkboard, trying to steady herself, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. The air felt too thick, too heavy, and she could hardly breathe. She struggled to focus on the children in front of her, trying to block out the noise and the overwhelming sensations that made her want to crawl out of her own skin. "Miss Whitlock?" Clara's voice cut through the haze of panic, sharp with concern. "Are you all right?" Annabelle's vision blurred as she struggled to stand, the room spinning around her. She shook her head, willing the dizziness to pass, but the buzzing in her ears only grew louder. "I'm fine," she managed to say, her voice cracking as she forced herself to smile, though it felt hollow and fragile. Clara didn't seem convinced. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on Annabelle's arm, but Annabelle jerked away from her touch, a wave of irritation and panic sweeping through her. "I say I'm fine," Annabelle snapped, her words sharp and unsteady. Clara recoiled, her eyes wide with concern, but Annabelle didn't wait for her to say anything else. She grabbed her coat from the back of the room and rushed out, the cool air of the hallway offering no relief from the storm raging inside her. The moment she stepped outside, everything intensified. The scent of earth and pine hit her like a tidal wave, and she could hear every distant rustle, every breath of the wind. The world had become a cacophony of noise and sensation that she couldn't escape. She didn't know what was happening, but she couldn't stay there anymore. The walls of the school felt like they were closing in on her. She stumbled down the steps, ignoring the way the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The panic inside her had risen to a fever pitch, and she found herself walking faster, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to get away, to escape the storm inside her. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the moon began to rise, its pale light casting an eerie glow over the town. Annabelle barely noticed as she made her way toward the woods, the trees calling to her with an irresistible pull. The aching in her bones began then, creeping up her spine like a slow burn. She stopped in her tracks, gasping for air as her body began to shift, her skin tingling with an unnatural heat. Her fingers curled involuntarily, the bones in her hands aching as they began to change. The pain was like nothing she had ever felt, sharp, burning, stretching, and she gasped in horror as her fingernails elongated, sharpening into claws. "No, no, no," she whispered to herself, but the words were lost in the mounting panic. Her vision blurred again, the world spinning around her as the transformation took hold. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. Her body was betraying her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She collapsed to the ground, her knees hitting the dirt as her body twisted, bones cracking and shifting as her wolf side forced its way to the surface. She gasped in pain, a cry escaping her throat as she clutched at the ground, trying to hold herself together, but it was no use. "Cole! I need Cole!" She could feel the bond between them pulsing, an undeniable pull that guided her through the pain. She wanted him. She needed him. In the distance she heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and purposeful, and her heart skipped in her chest. Cole. He was there in an instant, his form emerging from the shadows, his eyes glowing in the dark. His scent hit her before she saw him, earthy, familiar, and strong, and it made something deep within her stir. "Annabelle." Cole's voice was low, rough with urgency as he approached her. His eyes swept over her, taking in her transformed state, the way her body was caught between the woman she had been and the wolf that was emerging. "Don't fight it," he warned, his tone gentle but firm. But she couldn't help it. Panic surged through her again, the wild animalistic side of her taking over, and with a growl she lunged at him. The moment she did, something deep inside her broke free. Her senses sharpened, her body fast, her instincts wild, and she was attacking without thought, the wolf taking over completely. But Cole was faster. He caught her with ease, his powerful arms wrapping around her, holding her steady despite the strength she was trying to use against him. "Annabelle," he said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it now, a sense of authority. "This isn't something you can ignore." She thrashed against him, desperate to escape, but Cole held her firmly, his grip never faltering. His body was solid and unyielding as he whispered in her ear, his voice low and comforting. "I know it's terrifying, but you're not alone in this." Tears welled up in her eyes, the frustration and fear overwhelming her. Her body trembled, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she let herself go. The exhaustion of the transformation, the pain, the fear, it all came crashing down at once. She buried her face against his chest, her body racked with sobs. She had no control, no understanding of what was happening to her, and all she could do was cling to him as he held her, his warmth a steady anchor in the storm. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice breaking, her words trembling with raw emotion. "I don't know what's happening to me." Cole's arms tightened around her, pulling her closer. "I know, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice low and soothing, "but I'll help you through it. You're not alone, I promise." Annabelle closed her eyes, her body shaking in his arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe him. Chapter 3. Wolves at the Door. The moon hung high in the sky, a glowing silver orb casting its light across the quiet clearing. The forest around them whispered in the night air, the rustling leaves and distant howls adding an ethereal soundtrack to the moment. Annabelle stood in the middle of the clearing, her breath steady, her heart racing, her eyes locked with Cole's. Cole stood just a few feet away, watching her with that intense, unwavering gaze of his. He had been patient with her, guiding her through each step of the process, his voice always calm and steady as he taught her to harness the wild energy pulsing through her veins. It was strange to feel the power of the wolf inside her, coiled and waiting, like a live wire at the back of her mind. But under Cole's guidance, something clicked inside her, a feeling of control that she hadn't thought possible. Her body was no longer just reacting, it was responding, listening to his commands. "You're doing better," Cole said, his voice low with a hint of pride. He didn't often let his guard down, but she could hear it there, hidden just beneath his calm exterior. Annabelle exhaled slowly, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. She wasn't sure if it was from the exertion of sparring or the intensity of the pull between them, but there was something electric in the air whenever they practiced together. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to fight. She stood straighter, meeting his gaze. "I think I'm starting to get the hang of it," he grinned, that wicked smile of his that always made her heart skip. "Starting to? You've been keeping up better than I expected." Annabelle rolled her eyes, but there was a lightness in her chest, a warmth that hadn't been there before. It was the first time in days she felt like she wasn't just stumbling through this chaos, but actually, dare she say it, embracing it. She wasn't just learning to fight the change inside her, she was beginning to accept it. Cole took a step forward, his movements fluid and graceful, the way he always moved, like he was one with the earth beneath him. "All right, let's see how much you've really learned. One more round." Annabelle smirked, feeling the wolf inside her stir, eager for the challenge. "You're on." They circled each other, and the tension between them was palpable. The bond between them had only grown since the day she'd learned the truth. Their connection, her connection to him, had been undeniable from the moment they met, but now it was something more, something deeper. As they clashed, the sound of their feet shifting in the grass and the sharp breath between them was like a dance, a silent rhythm that only they could hear. She moved faster, her instincts guiding her, feeling the pull of his energy, the way he seemed to anticipate her every move. They were no longer just practicing, no longer just sparring. There was an unspoken challenge between them, something more primal, more intimate. They were pushing each other, testing boundaries not just of their skills, but of something far more elusive. Annabelle struck, a quick jab toward his side, but he blocked it easily, his arms coming up to catch hers in a smooth, practiced motion. "Not bad," Cole teased, his grin widening. Her chest tightened with the thrill of the fight, but it was his touch, his hand steady on hers, that sent a shiver down her spine. She wasn't sure if it was the fight, the bond, or something else entirely, but the air between them crackled with something electric. A connection so deep, so undeniable that she couldn't seem to pull away, no matter how hard she tried. Her breath came in quick gasps, and she glanced up at him, her chest rising and falling with exertion. There was a soft glow to his eyes, one that wasn't just the light of the moon, but something deeper, something more intimate. The pull between them was irresistible, and she could feel herself leaning toward him, drawn in by that magnetic force. For a moment the world around them faded away. It was just the two of them, caught in that delicate, dangerous tension. The cool night air, the quiet rustling of leaves, the subtle rhythm of their breaths, it all disappeared as he took a step closer, his hand brushing against her cheek. Annabelle's pulse thundered in her ears. Cole's fingers were gentle as he pushed a lock of hair behind her ear, his touch sending a wave of heat through her skin. The intimacy of the gesture, so simple yet so profound, had her breath catching in her throat. His touch lingered, his eyes never leaving hers, and for a heartbeat they just stood there, caught in that moment. And then, with a softness that startled her, he leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that started slow, tentative, as if they were both afraid to move too quickly, too suddenly. But the hesitation didn't last. As the kiss deepened, all the tension, all the uncertainty between them seemed to melt away. It was just him, just her. The bond between them thrumming like a pulse, steady and unyielding. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing harder, their faces flushed, their bodies still trembling with the intensity of the kiss. Annabelle's heart raced in her chest, and she could feel the weight of the bond between them, the connection that had only grown stronger since they first met. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything that neither of them was willing to say out loud, but both of them could feel. But that silence didn't last long. "Well," Annabelle said, breaking the quiet, her voice hoarse, "that was unexpected." Cole chuckled, the sound deep and rich, full of something unspoken. "You make it hard to focus when you do that." His voice dropped lower, the teasing replaced by something softer, something more serious. "But it's not just about training anymore, is it?" Annabelle's heart skipped a beat, and she found herself unable to answer, the weight of his words sinking in. She couldn't ignore the truth of their connection. The bond wasn't just something they were learning to live with. It was there between them, growing stronger every day. Before she could respond, a distant growl cut through the stillness of the forest, sharp and unsettling. Cole's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Annabelle's stomach dropped, the change in the air palpable. Something was wrong. Meanwhile, deeper in the woods, Silas Vane stood in the shadows, his eyes glowing with cold determination. Around him rogue wolves gathered, each of them watching him with a mix of loyalty and fear. His gaze swept over them, his voice a low growl. "The Alpha is weak," Silas said, his voice filled with disdain. "Bound to a human, that's not strength, that's a liability. And the pack needs strength." He turned to face the wolves, his expression fierce, his plans taking shape in his mind. The rogue wolves were hungry for power, for a change, and Silas had every intention of giving it to them. The coup was about to begin. The afternoon was unusually warm, the sun casting a golden glow over Silver Creek as Annabelle walked through the bustling streets. The town was quieter than usual, the energy shifting in the air, but Annabelle didn't know why. The shift in the atmosphere seemed to mirror her own unease, but she couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Cole. Everything he had said, everything he had promised. The bond between them had grown stronger, undeniable. But there was still something she couldn't shake, something in the back of her mind that whispered that all was not as it seemed. She had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that this connection was real, that Cole truly cared for her, but there had been moments, small things she couldn't explain away that made her wonder if there was more to the story than he had told her. As Annabelle neared the general store, she spotted Clara standing outside, looking unusually serious. Her best friend waved her over, her expression clouded with concern. "Annie," Clara said quietly as Annabelle approached, "I've been hearing rumors. Something's stirring trouble in town." Annabelle frowned, sensing that Clara wasn't just talking about gossip. "What kind of trouble?" Clara's gaze shifted to the side, her lips pressed into a thin line. "There's talk of rogue wolves. People are worried. They're saying that the pack's leadership is weakening, and some believe, well, that it's all because of Cole." Annabelle's chest tightened, her pulse quickening. She knew Clara wasn't one to entertain idle rumors, so whatever was being said had weight to it. But Cole? "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara hesitated before continuing. "Some say he's distracted, more focused on you than the pack, that you're a liability, a weakness. They think the Alpha shouldn't be tied to a human." The words stung more than Annabelle expected, and she took a step back, the ground beneath her suddenly feeling unsteady. A liability? A weakness? She didn't want to believe it, she couldn't, but Clara's words festered in her mind, gnawing at her. "Are you sure?" Annabelle asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Clara gave her a long, uncertain look. "I don't know, Annie. I don't know what to believe anymore. But there's something happening. You should be careful." Annabelle's stomach twisted in knots, a cold chill creeping through her. Clara's words echoed in her head as she made her way toward Cole's cabin that evening, her mind racing, the doubts growing harder to ignore. Later, as the moon rose high above the trees, Annabelle stood just outside the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. She had overheard something that made her freeze in place. Cole's voice, low and firm, speaking with his beta, Derek. "We need to contain the human threat," Cole had said, his voice tight with a hidden urgency. Annabelle's breath caught in her throat. The human threat. She leaned closer, hiding in the shadows, her heart beginning to race. She couldn't hear everything, but the words hung in the air like a weight. Contain the human threat. She thought back to Clara's words. A liability, a weakness. She stayed hidden, the truth slowly settling in her gut like a cold stone. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the cabin, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She had to confront him. She had to hear it from him. Annabelle stood in front of Cole's cabin, her breath shallow, her chest tight. Her body was trembling, her emotions bubbling over. She couldn't think clearly, but the one thing that was certain was that she had to confront him. She had to know the truth. Cole opened the door, his eyes lighting up when he saw her, but the warmth in his gaze didn't reach the corner of his mouth. Something was off. "Annie," he said, his voice low. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "That's what I want to know." Cole frowned. "What are you talking about?" Annabelle took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. She could feel the weight of the words on her tongue, the pain they would bring, but she couldn't stop them. "I heard you talking to Derek," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I heard you say you need to contain the human threat." Cole's face tightened, his jaw clenching, but he didn't say anything at first. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, before he finally spoke, his voice tight. "Annabelle, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Is that what I am to you? A threat? A liability?" Cole looked away, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite read. "It's not that simple." Annabelle took a step back, the raw hurt that flooded her chest threatening to crush her. "It's exactly that simple, Cole," she said, her voice small but cutting. I thought we were more than this. I thought I meant more to you than just something to control, something to manage." His eyes snapped to hers, his expression pained. "That's not what I meant. I never wanted to hurt you. Annabelle shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't get it, do you?" She laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "I'm just a part of your plan. I was just a way for you to control this, to control the pack. I never meant anything more to you than that. I was just a way to fix things, to make things easier." Cole's face twisted with frustration and anguish. "That's not true. I care about you, Annabelle. I didn't ask for any of this, but that doesn't mean I don't want you. I don't want to hurt you." Annabelle's chest tightened, the ache in her heart threatening to swallow her whole. "You lied to me. You used me," she whispered, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I was just part of your plan, just a way to fix things." She turned away, unable to look at him any longer, her heart breaking with every step she took. "Annie!" Cole's voice was hoarse, desperate, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She couldn't look at him, not with the weight of everything that had just fallen apart. The last thing she heard as she walked away was his voice calling her name, a broken plea that only made the pain inside her worse. Chapter 4. Enemy Moves. Silver Creek had always been a peaceful town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where children played in the streets and the days were marked by the rising and setting of the sun. But tonight there was a weight in the air, an uneasy quiet that clung to the buildings and streets like a shroud. Annabelle felt it as she stepped outside, the tension thick and heavy wrapping around her chest. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft light over the town, but the peaceful glow felt wrong tonight. It was as if something was lurking just out of sight, something dark and dangerous. Annabelle's senses were still raw from everything that had happened with Cole, everything that had shifted between them. The bond, the pull, the fear. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, the betrayal, the misunderstanding. But beneath it all, there was something else, something she couldn't explain. She couldn't ignore it, no matter how hard she tried. Her footsteps echoed on the cobblestone streets as she made her way toward the center of town. The sound of laughter drifted through the air from the local tavern, and for a moment she wished she could be like them. Unaware, carefree, but she wasn't. Not anymore. Something was coming. Inside the tavern, the atmosphere was lively. People were gathered around tables, their voices rising in cheerful chatter as they drank and ate, oblivious to the danger that was already creeping through the town. But the joviality wasn't enough to mask the tension in the air. Even the usual laughter felt strained, as though something was just about to snap. Outside, the sound of footsteps broke the silence, their rhythm steady and purposeful. Annabelle stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding as she instinctively turned toward the source of the sound, and then she heard it. A low growl so deep it seemed to shake the very air around her. Before she could react, there was a flash of movement in the shadows. Fast, agile, a blur of fur and muscle, and then a wolf was upon her. Its eyes glowed a sickly amber, its mouth open in a snarl, and its teeth gleamed in the moonlight. The attack was swift, merciless, and Annabelle barely had time to react before the wolf lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. Her heart raced, the world spinning around her as she struggled to get a grip. Her instincts screamed at her to fight back, but the wolf was too strong, its weight pinning her to the ground. The sharp scent of blood filled the air as it snapped its jaws closer to her face, the growl vibrating through her bones. And then there was a sudden deafening roar that shook the night, and the wolf was thrown off of her. "Annabelle!" It was Cole. His voice was filled with panic, but it quickly turned to fury as he faced down the rogue wolf. The animal snarled and bared its teeth, its eyes flashing with hatred as it circled him, clearly sizing him up. Annabelle scrambled to her feet, her legs shaky as she tried to find her balance. She could hear the distant sounds of more wolves, more than she could count, moving through the town. The attack wasn't an accident. This was planned. Before she could make sense of it all, another wolf lunged at Cole, and Annabelle's instincts kicked in. She felt the familiar pull of the bond between her and Cole, the connection that tied them together. With a surge of power, she reached into herself, drawing on the wolf within her. Her bones cracked as her body shifted, her claws digging into the earth beneath her. She squared her shoulders, body plastic. The transformation was fast, wild, and painful, but she didn't have time to focus on the pain. She was needed. With a roar, Annabelle charged forward, her senses sharp, her speed increased. She collided with the rogue wolf, knocking it off course just as it tried to bite Cole. Her teeth sunk into its flesh and the wolf howled in pain, but Annabelle didn't stop. The animal was no longer the one in control. She was. Cole stood back, watching her with a mixture of awe and concern, but there was no time for words. The rogue wolf was down, but more were coming, each one working together, attacking the town with precision and purpose. "There's more," Cole said, his voice tight with urgency. "They've infiltrated Silver Creek. This isn't just a random attack." Annabelle's heart sank, her mind racing. "What do you mean? Who is behind this?" Silas Vane. The name burned in her mind like a brand. The rogue alpha who had tried to take control of the pack before, the one who had always been hungry for power, willing to destroy anything that stood in his way. Annabelle didn't need to hear Cole's confirmation to know that Silas was behind this attack. She turned to face Cole, her expression fierce. "We have to stop them." Cole's eyes darkened with a determination that matched her own. "We will, but not alone. We need to get the town to safety." Annabelle nodded, her muscles coiled and ready. The fight was far from over, and as much as her heart ached with everything that had happened between them, there was no time to focus on that. The town was under attack, and the bond between her and Cole was the only thing that mattered now. Elsewhere in the forest, hidden in the shadows, Silas Vane stood with a smug grin on his face as he watched the chaos unfold. The rogue wolves moved with military precision, taking down townfolk and framing the Moonshadow Pack in the process. "They'll never suspect a thing," Silas murmured to himself, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "This town will burn, and when it does, Cole will fall. The pack will fall." He turned away, his hand tightening around the hilt of a blade. It was time to take control. The sound of chaos filled the air, sharp and unrelenting, as Silver Creek descended into madness. Annabelle's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted through the town's cobbled streets, the echo of howls and snarls from rogue wolves threatening to tear the night apart. The scent of smoke and blood hung heavy in the air, sharp and sickening. Every instinct in her screamed to fight, to protect, but she felt the pull of her own fear, the bond to Cole burning in the back of her mind. "The town needs me." She clenched her fists, her claws digging into her palms, the power surging through her like a wildfire. She had felt it before, this raging energy inside her, but now, in the face of real danger, it was uncontrollable. But she couldn't afford to hesitate. She couldn't let the town, her people, fall. Not after everything she had learned, everything she had come to embrace. She was more than a mere human now. She was a part of this world, bound by a fate that had been written long before she had stepped foot into it. "Whatever I am now," she whispered, her voice sharp with determination, "these people need me." Annabelle reached the town square just as the first wave of rogue wolves descended upon the heart of the town. The square, usually filled with bustling townsfolk and quiet vendors, had transformed into a battlefield. Wolves tore through the streets, knocking down buildings, crashing into the stone walls of the old town hall. Screams echoed through the chaos, the sounds of clashing metal and fur mixing with the cries of the injured. Annabelle's breath came in shallow, quick bursts as she moved into the fray. The moment she stepped into the square, a rogue wolf charged at her. Its glowing amber eyes locked onto hers, and for a second, time seemed to stretch. Without thinking, she released the wolf within her, the shift overtaking her body in an explosion of pain and power. Her claws lengthened, her muscles coiling as she met the wolf head-on. The fight was brutal and fast, but Annabelle was no longer the helpless human she had been. She moved with an agility she had never known, the bond between her and the wolf inside her giving her the strength she needed to land blows that knocked the rogue wolf back. But the moment she thought she had the upper hand, another wolf appeared from the shadows, joining the fight. It was a relentless, endless wave of attackers. She barely registered Cole's presence as he moved through the chaos, his wolf form a blur of motion, taking down rogues with deadly precision. His eyes found hers for a moment, and in that brief glance there was no question they were in this together. Meanwhile, at the center of the square, Silas Vane stood, his eyes burning with hatred and ambition. His voice cut through the fray, sharp and commanding. "Take them down! Leave no one standing!" Annabelle's stomach twisted as she saw him, Silas, the rogue alpha who had been plotting this moment for so long. His eyes locked onto Cole, a predatory gleam in his gaze. The moment their eyes met, the crowd of wolves parted, leaving a clear path between them. Cole didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his body tense, his expression set with grim determination. "You won't win, Silas," Cole growled, his voice carrying over the noise of the battle. Silas laughed, the sound dark and mocking. "You think your bond with her makes you stronger? You're weak, Cole. You're distracted. You should have known better than to let a human get between you and the pack." Annabelle's blood ran cold at the venom in Silas's words, and she felt the familiar tug of the bond between her and Cole, the magnetic pull that kept them tethered. It was a connection that had grown so strong, so undeniable that it made her heart ache. But Silas didn't understand it, didn't see it the way she did. He saw her as a liability, a threat to his ambitions. He saw her as weak, but she wasn't weak. The battle between Cole and Silas began with a violent clash. Silas attacked with brutal force, his body moving like a well-oiled machine, while Cole was more deliberate, more calculated, but clearly struggling. The fight was vicious, their claws slashing through the air, their growls reverberating through the square. Annabelle watched, her heart in her throat, as Cole faltered. His movements were slower now, his strikes not as strong as they should have been. She could see the blood on his body, the strain in his eyes. Silas was winning, and it made her feel helpless. "Cole!" she cried, her voice breaking through the noise. She wanted to run to him, but there was no time. He was too far away, and Silas was relentless. And then, in that moment of desperation, something inside Annabelle snapped. The power she had been trying to control, the power that had surged through her with every fight, it broke free. She could feel it. Her wolf side roaring to life with an intensity she had never experienced. The bond between her and Cole pulsed, and she reached for it, allowing it to fuel her, to guide her. Her senses sharpened, and the world around her slowed as her focus honed in on Silas. With a fierce growl, Annabelle charged forward, her wolf instincts taking over as she moved faster than she had ever moved before. The moment Silas turned his head to face her, she slammed into him with all her force, knocking him off balance. For a moment, Silas was stunned. Annabelle's power was overwhelming, more than he had expected, and he stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief. She didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, Annabelle plunged her claws into Silas's side, sending a shock of pain through him. Silas roared in fury, but he couldn't break free. He was weaker than he realized. And then, with a surge of strength, she pushed him back toward Cole, who was already rising to his feet, his eyes filled with gratitude and surprise. Annabelle didn't wait to see if he could finish the fight. She didn't need to. She knew he would. As Cole lunged forward, his strike was precise and lethal, driving Silas into the dirt. The rogue alpha's body crumpled beneath him, defeated. For a long moment there was silence. The only sound was the ragged breaths of the fighters, the distant cries of the injured. Annabelle stood there, panting, her body still trembling from the fight. Cole's hand brushed against hers, and the contact sent a spark of warmth through her, grounding her in the moment. He turned to her, his eyes softening, the intensity of the battle still hanging in the air, but now there was a tenderness there, too. "You're incredible," he said, his voice low and filled with admiration. Annabelle met his gaze, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name, something that was more than just the bond. It was trust, love, and a connection that no enemy, no fight could ever break. And together they would rebuild. The battle had ended, but the aftermath was far from peaceful. The ground beneath Annabelle's feet was slick with blood, the air heavy with the scent of smoke, sweat, and the sharp tang of battle. Her muscles still thrummed with the raw power of the wolf within her, and every breath she took felt deeper, sharper, as if the world had somehow become more alive. Silas lay motionless on the ground, his body crumpled in the dirt after Cole's final blow. His reign of chaos was over, but the victory felt hollow in the face of what had come at such a high cost. Annabelle's eyes never left Cole. He was kneeling a few feet away, blood dripping from several wounds across his chest, his arm hanging at an awkward angle. The sight of him, battered and bloodied, made her heart clench with both fear and disbelief. He had been so close to losing everything, so close to being taken from her. Her legs moved before she could stop them, her breath quickening as she reached him. "Cole," she called, her voice breaking as she crouched beside him. He looked up at her, his eyes flickering with a mix of exhaustion and a weary smile, as though he could feel her concern wrapping around him like a rope. His lips parted, and despite the blood on his face, he still managed to speak, his voice hoarse but strong. "Annabelle, I'm okay. We won." Her breath hitched. "You're not okay," she whispered urgently, her hands trembling as she touched his shoulder. "You're hurt. You're badly hurt." Cole's jaw clenched as he took a shallow breath, his eyes full of pain but still determined. "I'll be fine," he tried to reassure her, but the weakness in his voice gave him away. Annabelle wasn't sure where the strength came from, but a sudden surge of fury and protective instinct surged through her, flooding her veins like wildfire. She couldn't lose him, not like this. "Don't say that," she whispered fiercely, her gaze darting over the cuts and bruises that covered his body. He was bleeding far too much, his movements sluggish, and the energy draining from him far too quickly. She had to do something. "You're not fine, Cole." The bond between them pulsed like an electric current. It was still there, still as strong as ever, and Annabelle could feel his pain, his weakness, and his exhaustion. But most of all, she felt the bond, a thread of their souls connecting them. Her heart clenched as she realized something. She could do something. Without thinking, she shifted. The transition was smooth now, seamless, as her wolf side emerged with an instinctive force. She could feel her strength returning, and energy flowing through her as she sank into her wolf's form. With newfound clarity, Annabelle felt the raw power surge through her, filling her veins with heat and strength. Her wolf half had always been there, ready to protect, but now something had changed. The pull of the bond to Cole had unlocked something deeper within her, something wild and primal. Her senses sharpened to a level she had never experienced before. She could smell the blood pooling around them, the cold night air, the faint trace of pine in the breeze. Her eyes locked onto Cole's, and she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she could save him, that she would save him. She placed her hands on his chest, her claws grazing his skin with careful precision. Her wolf side hummed with the need to heal, to fix, to protect him. The world around them seemed to fall away as she focused on the bond that tied them together. She closed her eyes, calling on the power inside her, and the magic of the wolf responded. Her body surged with energy, and a soft, almost glowing light surrounded her hands. The bond between them flared, and for a brief, electrifying moment she could feel Cole's pulse in her fingertips. Annabelle breathed deeply, letting the power of her wolf side guide her. Her claws sunk into the skin over his heart, and the glow intensified. The pain in his body responded to her, her power flowing into him, mending the broken pieces. She could feel the jagged edges of his ribs knitting back together, the blood slowing, the wounds closing. It was a strange, exhilarating feeling, healing him from the inside out, the power surging through her as if it were second nature. It was like breathing, only it was his life force she was helping to restore, A soft gasp escaped her as she felt his pulse steady. His wounds were healing faster than she'd expected, the worst of the damage slowly ebbing away under her touch. The bond between them pulsed again, this time with a soft, almost tender warmth, as if Cole were feeling what she was doing to him, sharing in the healing as it happened. When she opened her eyes, she saw Cole's face, his features softening in a way that made her heart skip. His breath was steady now, his body no longer trembling with pain. You did it," Cole breathed, his voice thick with amazement and gratitude. His hands rose to cup her face, and his touch was warm and steady. His strength had returned, though there was still a glimmer of awe in his eyes, as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. Annabelle smiled, a rush of relief flooding her chest as she felt the last of his wounds close. She had done it. She had saved him. But it wasn't just his body she had healed. It was the bond between them. The connection that had been so fragile, so uncertain before, now it felt stronger than ever, more real. "I won't lose you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her hand trailing down his arm, feeling the strength returning to him. Her heart beat with a gentle rhythm of its own as she looked into his eyes. Not like this, not after everything. Cole's expression softened, and he pulled her into him, his strong arms enveloping her in a tight, comforting embrace. His breath was warm against her neck as he held her close, the intensity of the moment not lost on either of them. "You saved me," he said quietly, the gratitude in his voice ringing clear. "I don't deserve you, Annabelle, but I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving how much I need you." Annabelle closed her eyes, feeling the bond between them pulse once more, stronger than ever. She wasn't sure what the future held for them. There was still danger ahead, and there would be challenges to face, but right now, in this moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. With Cole by her side, there was nothing they couldn't face together. "You're my mate," she said softly, the words slipping from her lips, a quiet promise. "And I'm yours." The soft light of dawn spread slowly over Silver Creek, casting a golden glow over the town that had been torn apart by chaos and fear. The streets, though marked by the remnants of battle, were slowly coming back to life as the townsfolk ventured out, their movements tentative but filled with hope. The scent of fresh-baked bread and blooming flowers carried on the morning breeze, mixing with the crisp air of the mountains. Annabelle stood by the window of her cabin, watching the town below as the warmth of the sun washed over her. It felt strange, this sense of peace, this quiet moment after everything that had happened. The rogue wolves had been driven out, their threat neutralized, but there was still a sense of change in the air. Silver Creek was different now. It wasn't just the town that had changed, though. She had changed too. Her senses were still sharp, her connection to the pack undeniable. But more than that, her bond with Cole had deepened in ways she never could have anticipated. It had been a long, hard road to get here, filled with doubt, fear, and anger, but now, as the light of the new day broke over the land, she knew it was all worth it. As she turned from the window, she caught sight of Clara coming toward her, a broad grin on her face. Her best friend, ever the light-hearted and determined woman, enveloped Annabelle in a tight hug before she could react. "Told you that man was trouble," Clara teased, her voice full of affection. "Look at you two now. I never thought I'd see the day when you'd fall for a wolf, but here we are." Annabelle laughed, the sound soft and happy as she hugged Clara back, her heart light. "He's not just a wolf," she said with a smile, the words slipping out without thought. But they felt true. "He's my wolf." Clara's eyes softened and she stepped back, giving Annabelle a knowing look. "I knew you'd come around. You two are perfect for each other." Annabelle's smile widened, her heart swelling at the truth in Clara's words. She had come to realize that her life, her heart, had always been meant for Cole. There was no turning back from that now. Later, as the sun sank low in the sky, Annabelle and Cole walked hand in hand up a quiet hill on the outskirts of Silver Creek. The wind had picked up and the air was cooling, but the golden light of the setting sun bathed them both in a soft, warm glow. The town below, once in turmoil, now seemed peaceful, serene even, with the promise of a new beginning. They reached the top of the hill and paused, standing together, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The moment felt heavy with unspoken words, yet everything between them was already clear. There were no more walls between them, no more doubts. Everything had been laid bare, and there was only one thing left to say. Cole's fingers brushed gently against Annabelle's, his touch sending a spark through her skin. He turned to face her, his eyes soft and serious. "I chose you," he said, his voice steady but with an emotion that resonated deeply in her chest. "From the moment I saw you, from the moment our paths crossed, I knew. I chose you." Annabelle's breath caught in her throat, her heart swelling at the intensity of his words. She searched his eyes, her own welling with emotion. "And I choose you," she whispered, the words flowing from her heart, the truth of them undeniable. "I always have, even when I didn't know it." A tear slid down her cheek, but it wasn't one of sadness. It was of relief, of peace, of a love so deep and strong it could withstand anything. Cole reached out, wiping the tear away with the pad of his thumb, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't know how long I've waited for this moment," Cole said softly, his voice thick with the weight of everything they had been through. "How long I've wanted to tell you that you're everything to me." Annabelle's lips trembled as she met his gaze, the words catching in her throat. She didn't need to speak, they both knew the truth. They had been through too much, had faced too many challenges, but now, standing together on this hill, beneath the setting sun, they knew they had made it, together. The sun finally dipped below the horizon and the sky darkened, but it was not the end. It was the beginning of something new, something bright, something full of promise. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, the full moon rose high above them, casting its silvery glow over the world. Hand in hand, Annabelle and Cole stood together, gazing up at the moon, its light bathing them in warmth and serenity. The bond between them was undeniable, their connection more solid than ever before. The pack was whole again, Silver Creek was safe, and Annabelle had finally found her place in this world. Not as a human, not as an outsider, but as his. A wolf's distant howl broke the silence, drifting on the wind, and Annabelle smiled softly. The sound was no longer one of threat or fear, but of peace, of unity. It was the call of her mate, the call of their pack. With Cole by her side, there was nothing she couldn't face. And as the full moon hung above them, a beacon of light in the night sky, they stood together, hand in hand, ready for whatever the future held. For they were no longer just two souls lost in a chaotic world. They were two halves of a whole, bound by fate, by love, by a promise made under the watchful eyes of the stars. "Whatever comes next," Annabelle whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "we'll face it together." Cole turned to her, his smile soft and full of warmth, his eyes glowing with a love that matched her own. "Together," he echoed, and with that they watched the full moon rise, a new beginning unfolding before them. End.